privilege to have this amazing sort of a social and musical journey of your past and your influences and what got you to where you are, Rick. What have we just heard?
Well, we started with some country music that really formed part of my early upbringing and got me involved with music and a desire to play guitar through some of the Nashville kind of songbook singers, and then had a little bit of the religious background that's kind of inspired a lot of my creativity as I've gone forward outside of music as well. And we couldn't. I grew up in Michigan. You can't not hear the Stooges, and but the defining point was getting a Bowie, and it was actually an 8-track tape, for those who remember, an 8-track tape of Changes that actually really sparked my interest in music. I wanted to move on to the next part, and the whole punk scene was kicking off in the New York space and in the London area, and as much as I lived out in the middle of nowhere, you could still get exposed to the Sex Pistols, the Damned, the Ramones, all the kind of the big bands of the scene.
So you felt very on top of that. You were able to access that.
I felt on top of it for what I had access to.
Okay.
But our musical papers, like the Rolling Stones, were still very focused on American kind of middle of the road rock and roll, and you could see what was the most popular, across the water, but you didn't really get underneath it. And so at that point in time, my friends and I were getting into the ska scene, the punk scene in my school, and then I went to school in the first day of school in my last year. This beautiful exotic creature kind of walked across in a homemade mohair jumper, short skirt, and pointy shoes, and was like an alien figure in the environment that I lived in, and that kind of really sparked the next chapter of kind of my musical growth. And so that's Sophie, who's sitting across from me. We connected actually over punk music, because I had asked her a question about a lyric that was in French, and she had Richard Hell on her school notebook. She had Richard Hell crucified on a cross, if I remember right. She had cut out all these little images and pictures and things and pasted them all over this school notebook. And the thing that really expanded my musical horizon is that when her and her twin sister Chantel came over, they come over with piles of compilation cassette tapes, because they thought the American music was going to be horrible, which they were largely right. But it actually allowed me to have access to stuff that I never would have been able to find. It would have been, very bizarre things, like Fad Gadget, for example, is not something you would have come across on American radio, or Au Pairs, or, some of those type bands. So I actually really expanded my knowledge of what was going on in Europe through all of those tapes. And we're going to play a track from one of the bands that was on this tape that struck me as something very, very different from all of the rest of the bands that were kind of part of the punk scene that I had access to. And the thing I really loved about it was that it wasn't in its traditional sense. It was very experimental, very raw. Again, it was very visceral. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about it is that unlike the Pistols that had this swagger and Lydon's, angst, the music behind it still had this kind of guitar thrust, so Steve Jones is still a little bit like, the New York Dolls and Johnny Thunders, and as much as I love the New York Dolls and Johnny Thunders, a little bit like the Stones with Richards, and there's kind of a bit of a lineage back through the music, and it wasn't kind of a deconstruction as much as it was an adaptation and making it angry. I thought this band, when I first heard it, was like, this is just deconstructed the concept of music. It's very experimental, very angst-ridden, and I just immediately fell in love with it. The reason I'm picking this particular track is because Sophie had this particular album on a cassette tape, and this is the very first song off the first side of this album, and so therefore this is the first track I've ever heard from Crass.